Yo, Lupercalia! If you are fed up of Valentine's Day, why not celebrate Lupercalia instead? This ancient Roman festival took place on the 15th of February and involved running naked through the streets and hitting women with goat skins. Give it a try. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet, I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover myth, legend, ghost stories, folklore, and weird and wonderful history in general. So today, the history of the Lupercalia festival. Please forgive me if you hear random pitter-patter noises and clanking sounds during this video. The puppy is at my feet and he's too little to really have learned to just lie down while I film a video just yet, so if you hear weird noises, it's the dog. The Lupercalia took its name from the Lupercal. This was a cave at the foot of the Palatine Hill in Rome, one of the 7 hills in Rome. The cave was a prominent feature in Rome's founding myth. According to Roman mythology, the city was founded by 2 brothers called Romulus and Remus. They were the sons of a Vestal virgin called Rhea Silvia, who had been either seduced or assaulted by the god Mars, depending on which version you are reading, and she had got pregnant, and the children were then exposed at birth because she was a Vestal virgin, and therefore this was sacrilegious, even though a god had done it. So the twin boys were exposed and left to the elements to die, but they were found and suckled by a she-wolf in the cave of the Lupercal. So the Lupercalia is a festival looking back to Rome's founding myth. The brothers would go on to found the city of Rome, Romulus would kill Remus, and Romulus would be the one who built the city and had it named after him. The festival was run by a priestly association of elite Roman men called the Luperci. They would sacrifice goats and a dog at the cave of the Lupercal. Romans were generally very fond of dogs, just like us, they had them as pets. There's a famous mosaic from Pompeii that says Cave Canem, which means beware of the dog. We've also found the hole in the lava that is the remains of a dog in Pompeii. Romans absolutely loved dogs, so why on earth they were sacrificing a dog as part of this festival, I don't know, but it was a very old festival. Celebrating Rome's founding mythology goes right back to the early days of the Republic. The priests, known as the Luperci, would then run naked through the streets of Rome except for a girdle, and they would strike women with thongs made from the skin of the goat, and this was meant to help with fertility. It was meant to help women get pregnant or ensure a safe delivery of a child if they were pregnant. So women would hold out their hands and kind of want people to do this. They're not attacking women or being violent towards women. One assumes that they are tapping them lightly with the goat skin. They're not like whipping them and being violent or aggressive with it. The festival is described by Plutarch in his biography of Julius Caesar. Plutarch is a Greek writing in the Roman period, around the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century CE. He was a priest of Delphi, so he's very familiar with Greek religion, but he was also a Roman citizen, and he knew a fair bit about Roman religion and Roman history as well. He introduces the festival of the Lupercalia, saying that many write it was anciently celebrated by shepherds, and has also some connection with the Arcadian Lycaea, which is an entirely different festival involving stories about werewolves. At this time, many of the noble youths and magistrates run up and down through the city naked for sport and laughter, striking those they meet with shaggy thongs. And many women of rank also purposely get in their way, and like children at school present their hands to be struck, believing that the pregnant will thus be helped to an easy delivery and the barren to pregnancy. As for why they celebrated the festival in this way, that was a question Romans were asking themselves as well. It's a very, very old festival. It clearly goes back to the very earliest days of Rome and the very earliest customs and legends. We have some explanation provided by the poet Ovid from the 1st century BC or BCE. Ovid is writing during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. He was eventually exiled from an unspecified mistake. Ovid wrote an entire poem about how to have sex with other men's wives, and Augustus exiled his own daughter for sleeping with half of Rome. Ovid may have slept with her, dates don't entirely match, but it's possible, or Augustus may have just not liked his poetry. But Ovid did write other poems as well, and later on in his life he wrote a poem called Fasti, which describes the religious festivals of Rome and the mythology behind them. Unfortunately, we only have the first 6 months. We have January to June, we don't have July to December. But the Lupercalia took place in February, so we have Ovid's description of the myth behind the Lupercalia and of the festival itself. Ovid is writing very artistic poetry. He is going to be taking some artistic license. He is going to be doing his own thing with the material. But we tend to assume that his description of these festivals and their origins is not completely out of the realm of reality or completely different from how anyone else would describe them or what happened, because Ovid lived in Rome for many years until he was exiled, and the poem wouldn't make any sense if he just completely made it up. If Ovid is literally just attaching new stories to things or describing festivals in ways that aren't really how they work, then the poem wouldn't make sense to anybody and it wouldn't have been popular enough to survive for 2,000 years. Describing the festival of Lupercalia, Ovid says, "This third morning after the Ides of February sees the naked Luperci and the rites of two-horned Faunus enacted." Faunus is a Roman god, similar to a Greek satyr, a man with goat legs. Ovid also seems to be identifying him a bit with the Greek god Pan, who is also a god with goat legs, who is associated with shepherds, with pastoral, but also with erotic activity. Pierian muses tell the origin of the rites and where they were brought from to our Latin home. They say the ancient Arcadians worshipped Pan, the god of cattle, he of the mountain heights. Evander brought his woodland gods with him. Evander is another kind of founding figure in the legends of Rome, who's supposedly come across from Greece. There where Rome stands, there was merely a sight. Why, you ask, do the Luperci run? And, since it's their custom, this running, why do they strip their bodies naked? The god himself loves to run swiftly on the heights, and he himself suddenly takes to flight. The god himself is naked and orders his servants naked. And the Greek Pan and the Roman Faunus are always depicted as naked. They say the Arcadians had the land before the birth of Jove, and their race is older than the moon. They lived like beasts, lives spent to no purpose. People lived in the open and went about nude, inured to heavy downpours from rain-filled winds. To this day, the naked priests recall the memory of old customs and testify to those ancient ways. So here he's connecting the nudity of the priests in the festival with ancient people before urban living who he imagines are wandering around the countryside naked in their prehistoric state. But why Faunus especially shunned clothing is handed down in an old tale full of laughter. Well, this is a very long tale, so I'm not going to tell it right now. It's a story about Faunus trying to have his way with Omphale, a queen who is at that time being served by Hercules, Greek Heracles, as her slave or servant. It's a rather long section of the poem. I will put a link below to a really good modern translation of this poem from poetryandtranslation.com, and you can go and read the whole section there if you want to. But I am going to carry on with what Ovid has to say about the festival of Lupercalia itself, rather than this diversion he goes off on about a story about Faunus and Omphale. A she-goat was sacrificed to cloven Faunus as usual, and a crowd had been invited to the scanty feast. Romulus and his brother and a shepherd boy exercised their naked bodies on the sunlit plain. So here he's associating it with Romulus and Remus being naked when they are young. Then he goes on to discuss the actual function of the festival. Bride, why linger? No potent herb or prayer or magic spell can make you a mother. A grove below the Esquiline hill, untouched for many years, was sacred to great Juno. When they had gathered, their husbands and wives bowed their knees alike in supplication. And suddenly the treetops moved and trembled, and the goddess spoke strange words in her grove. Let the sacred he-goat pierce the Italian wives. The crowd stood terrified at the troubling words. There was an augur, his name is lost with the years, but he had lately arrived in exile from Tuscany. He killed a he-goat, and at his command the wives offered their backs to be beaten by thongs from its hide. When the moon renewed her horns in her 10th orbit, the husband became a father and the wife a mother. Romans thought pregnancy lasted 10 months. Thanks be to Lucina, goddess, you took that name from the grove, that's Lucas, or as yours is the sort of light, Lucas. Gracious Lucina, spare women heavy with child, I beg you, and bring the ripe burden tenderly from the womb. And this refers to an aspect of the goddess Juno, Juno Lucina, particularly associated with childbirth. I mentioned that Plutarch describes this festival in the course of his biography of Julius Caesar. That's because it was at the Lupercalia that a famous incident took place that was one of the reasons a conspiracy formed to assassinate Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Around this time, in mid-February of 44, Caesar had had himself proclaimed dictator for life. The position of dictator was supposed to be an emergency position given to somebody so they could deal with some kind of crisis in the Roman state, and they were supposed to resign when the crisis had passed. An earlier dictator, earlier in the 1st century, had done so, Sulla. But Julius Caesar, even after the civil war had passed and he had won the civil war and everything seemed to be at peace, would not give up the position of dictator. And then in February of 44, he had himself made dictator for life. This sounded suspiciously like king, and the Romans did not want kings. The Romans had killed their previous king many centuries earlier, and they were very keen not to end up in a monarchy or a tyranny again. And around the same time this incident takes place at the Lupercalia on the 15th. Plutarch tells us it was namely the festival of the Lupercalia. These ceremonies Caesar was witnessing seated upon the rostra on a golden throne arrayed in triumphal attire. The rostra is the platform in the Roman Forum which people would give speeches from in the Republic if they were trying to get elected, political speeches, that kind of thing. And Antony, that's Mark Antony, was one of the runners in the sacred race, for he was consul. So Mark Antony holds one of these priesthoods. He's one of the Luperci. Roman priesthoods are held by members of the elite, people high up in Roman politics, as a kind of symbolic part-time role. They will oversee religious ritual, and then the actual kind of killing of animal sacrifices and so on will be done by servants. In this case, obviously, the Luperci themselves run naked through the streets. Accordingly, after he, Antony, had dashed into the forum and the crowd had made way for him, he carried a diadem round which a wreath of laurel was tied and held it out to Caesar. Then there was applause, not loud, but slight and preconcerted. But when Caesar pushed away the diadem, all the people applauded. When Antony offered it again, few, and when Caesar declined it again, all applauded. The experiment having thus failed, Caesar rose from his seat after ordering the wreath to be carried up to the Capitol. This incident is described in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. Mark Antony appears shortly after doing this, and Brutus and Cassius talk about it. Cassius tells Brutus about it. We don't actually see it happen on stage in Shakespeare's play, partly probably because of the practicalities of the crowd. I was also very disappointed that the BBC HBO series Rome did not show us this scene. They did have James Purefoy as Mark Antony strip off and be completely naked several times in other scenes, but for whatever reason, the point where he historically accurately should have been naked, they decided not to show as part of the show. I was very disappointed by that. Plutarch was writing a long time later, but the incident is also described by Cicero, who was actually there. He was an eyewitness. This is in a speech called the Second Philippic. The Philippics were a series of speeches against Mark Antony that Cicero wrote after Julius Caesar had died. They are all about how awful Mark Antony is. Cicero and Mark Antony hated each other for a series of reasons, including Cicero having had Mark Antony's stepfather executed. They absolutely loathe each other. So this is a series of speeches from Cicero about how Antony is terrible. In fairness to Cicero, he is also trying to preserve the Roman Republic, sadly unsuccessfully. He addresses Antony directly in this speech, or rather written text. He says, "Your colleague, Caesar, was sitting in the rostra clothed in purple robe on a golden chair wearing a crown." So Caesar is clearly styling himself like a king, knowing that the Romans do not want a king, that the Republic is designed to prevent anyone from becoming a king, but Caesar seems determined to become one anyway. "You, Mark Antony, mount the steps. You approach his chair. If you were a priest of Pan, you ought to have recollected that you were consul too." So he's saying, okay, yes, you're a priest of Pan, of Faunus. You're doing your part in this ritual, but you're also Roman consul, and you shouldn't be approaching another Roman politician naked like this. "You display a diadem. There is a groan over the whole forum. Where did the diadem come from? For you had not picked it up when lying on the ground, but brought it from home with you. A premeditated and deliberately planned wickedness." He's also making a slight reference there to the fact that Antony is in fact naked and has been concealing this diadem somewhere, although in practical terms he probably had a slave bring it for him. "You placed the diadem on his head amid the groans of the people. He rejected it amid great applause. You then alone, O wicked man, were found both to advise the assumption of kingly power and to wish to have him for your master who was your colleague, and also to try what the Roman people might be able to bear and endure." So Caesar is the other consul. They are supposed to be jointly ruling. There are two consuls in Republican Rome. They rule together. Cicero is doing something that Greek and Roman political writers often did, which is compare living under a monarchy to being enslaved. They usually do this from a position of never having been enslaved, but they use it as a sort of a metaphor, and even a bit stronger than a metaphor. The idea is that if you live under a monarchy, you are all enslaved because you are all at the mercy of the monarch, who can abuse their power and do whatever they want to you, basically. And Cicero extends the metaphor, saying, "You even sought to move his pity. You threw yourself at his feet as a suppliant, begging for what? To be a slave? You might beg it for yourself when you had lived in such a way from the time you were a boy that you could bear everything and would find no difficulty in being a slave, but certainly you had no commission from the Roman people to try such a thing for them. So he's suggesting that if Mark Antony wants to enslave himself to Julius Caesar, he is free to do so, but please don't do it on behalf of everybody else. And then he harps on a bit more about this. Oh, how splendid was that eloquence of yours when you harangued the people stark naked, emphasising the nudity, partly because enslaved people were often bought and sold in the marketplace nude so that people could see what they were buying. So by emphasising Antony's nudity, which is part of the religious festival, Cicero is also emphasising that Antony is behaving as if he was Julius Caesar's slave, not his equal colleague as consul. What could be more foul than this, more shameful than this, more deserving of every sort of punishment? And then he goes on for a while. What can be more scandalous than for that man to live who placed a diadem on a man's head when everyone confessed that that man was deservedly slain who rejected it? So Caesar has been killed by the time Cicero writes this, and he's basically saying that Antony should have been killed as well and should be killed because Antony is equally culpable in trying to make Rome into a monarchy as Caesar. And both Cicero and Plutarch are pretty clear that this is an attempt on the part of Caesar and Antony to make Caesar into a king. There were other similar incidents around the same time as well, laurel wreaths appearing on the heads of Caesar's statue and things like that. And Caesar was assassinated by a conspiracy only 1 month later on the Ides of March, 44 BC, the conspiracy led by Brutus and Cassius. They didn't include Cicero, possibly because Cicero could be a bit flaky and interested in self-preservation sometimes. But Cicero was very angry that they left him out, and very angry that they didn't kill Mark Antony as well, as he felt that Antony was just as dangerous as Julius Caesar. Plutarch, with the benefit of hindsight, having lived through many years of monarchy by that point, he suggests it's an experiment. He thinks that it's a trial run. That if, when Antony offered Caesar the diadem, the crowd had cheered, then Caesar would simply have accepted it and would have more or less made himself king at that point. Because the crowd booed, they try it a couple more times, the crowd are still booing, they don't want Caesar to be king and wear this diadem, even though he's already wearing purple, which is a royal colour, and sitting on a golden throne. But clearly this crowning of him is a step too far, and so they let it go, and Caesar manages to win more kind of cachet with the crowd by refusing the diadem, even though Plutarch is pretty clear that if the crowd had been more positive, he would have accepted it. But he's able to say, no, 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 I don't want to be king. Do not worry. I want to protect the Republic. And all the blame can then be pinned on Mark Antony for trying to crown him. So that's just a brief introduction to the festival of Lupercalia and its place in Roman history. Why on earth they continued to run around naked for this festival in February, I do not know. It is not that warm in February in Italy. It snows in Italy sometimes. It rains a lot. February in Italy is cold. So why on earth these wealthy, elite, powerful men continued to run around naked in February, I do not know. But it was an ancient festival. They were respecting their ancient traditions. And of course, it's clearly a very public festival. There are clearly plenty of women attending in hopes of achieving pregnancy or a successful and healthy childbirth. So it continues to be celebrated for a very long time. So if you fancy a change from Valentine's Day, run naked through the streets hitting women with goatskin. Why not? If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. If you are interested in ancient Rome and Roman history, you might enjoy my book, Creepy Classics. This is a short story collection that retells 13 ghost stories from ancient Roman texts, including one from Cicero and one from Plutarch. In fact, it is from Plutarch's Life of Caesar, a story about Brutus seeing his own evil spirit. So you can pick that up from Amazon, paperback or ebook, and it's also in Kindle Unlimited. And that's a really good way to support the channel if you would like to do so. And until next time, bye! Here is where the pup has been lying. He's been a very good boy. He did very well, only moved around and ruined my takes, clanging his collar around a few times. He's very sleepy. He had a good walk earlier today with our lovely dog walker while I was out teaching. Are you sleepy? You going to say hello to the people? Nope, he is out for the count.